in this lesson, we'll take a look at how we can use procedural nodes to add a little bit of noise to the specularity of one of our materials. So let's jump back into that material that we added. And let's go ahead, I'm just going to go into that gray material. And inside of the specular color, instead of using one color across the whole surface, let's use a 3D texture. And let's just use a Brownian noise. Now you can kind of see in our view how that's affecting our metal. So it makes it shiny in some spots and not so shiny in other spots. You can take some of these settings in here and modify it, make it a little bit more, give it a little bit more contrast. You can also render this to kind of see how it's going to look. Let's go to Metal Ray. It's going to look a little bit different than it does in the viewport. Now you can see it's really reflective right now, which doesn't show up in the viewport. So if we go back to our texture, so right now we're in the Brownian, we can use these buttons to move around within our node network. And let's actually look at that node network. So we haven't done that yet. So let's jump into our Hypershade, and we're working with this gray metal. So if I select the material and I come up here and map it out with this button, I can see all the inputs and outputs. So what I'm looking at is the placement node for this Brownian node and the fact that it is going into the specular color. So we can kind of see where that's going. And then here is the material. Okay, so whenever we have one of these, you can use these buttons to move around. So you can see now I popped up to the metal, or I can go backwards into the node. So you can use these buttons to kind of move around within this node network. All right. So let's, inside of our material, let's take our reflectivity and we'll take that down. And then if we re-render that, and I'm just hitting this render button right up here, we'll look more at rendering later. But some of these materials, some of these nodes will look a little bit different in the render than they might in the viewport preview. You can see it here. We do get an indication of that specularity kind of changing across the surface, but it looks a little bit different when we render it up. So keep that in mind, although it's nice because we don't need the UVs for those because of the way that these are created. We've got this 3D placement node, so think of it kind of like you've got this object flowing through a solid block of this noise, and it kind of shows you the result of that. All right. So you can play around with those, some of those nodes in here, the 3D texture. You've got cloud, you've got crater, which is kind of cool. Create some interesting effects with that. Solid fractal. And so you can try out some of these and just pipe them into the color so you can kind of see them. Make sure you have your hardware texturing on. You may need to render it to see exactly what it's going to look like. So the next thing we want to do is we want to create some UVs because we're going to be sort of limited in what we can add to this until we have at least some rudimentary UVs. And so let's talk about that coming up in the next lesson.